is located in the northeast of Jakarta. As you may know, Jakarta is one of the great mega cities of Asia. A recent statistic showed that there are 26 million motorbikes in Jakarta, which must be the largest number of motorbikes anywhere in the world. Welcome to our Zoominar program. This is the beginning of the second semester, and the general theme of the series of Zoominars is language, society, and education. So far, we've tended to concentrate on language, but I hope that we can open it up to issues of society and education more broadly. The scope is international, but there's also an Indonesian flavor to the sessions, and we'll be talking about Indonesia in today's meeting. Before we begin, I'd like to invite Professor Dedi Purwana, who's the director of the graduate school, to say a few words to us. Dedi, silakan.
Thank you, Howell. Good afternoon, everybody.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
First of all, I would like to say thank you to Dr. Subhan Zain. It's our pleasure to have you here in our routine program, monthly international program. It is quite amazing when I read your academic track record. You just received as a top awarded Australia 2021 top researcher language and literature. I believe this is a good opportunity for us to have top researchers in language and literature from Australia, and we are very pleased to have you, and please sharing with our students and our participants. This monthly international Zoominar is part of our vision, being a reputable postgraduate program in Asia region. So we try to develop international activities. This is the one we routinely conduct for our lecturer and our student in postgraduate at Universitas Negeri Jakarta. Thank you again, Professor Subhan. Thanks also to Dr. Howell Coleman. Without him, this occasion will not happen. Thank you, Howell. And I hope in the near future, Howell and also Pak Faisal will again and again to run international initiative program to be benefit for our institution. Thank you. And this Pak Professor Siono is Vice Rector for Academic Affairs on behalf of Rector to open this occasion officially. Thank you, Howell.
Thank you. Suyono, would you like to say something?
Okay, yes, thank you, Prof. Howell. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The Honorable, the Director of Postgraduate UNJ, Professor Dedi Purwana, and the Honorable our speaker for today's seminar, Subhan Zain, PhD from Australian National University, Canberra. Also the moderator, Professor Howell, and distinguished guests and participants. On behalf of the Director of UNJ, I would like to welcome you to the monthly international program Language, Society, and Education. Firstly, I'd like to express my appreciation to the postgraduate school, UNJ, for initiating this seminar. For UNJ, the collaboration seminar like this is very important. It is one activity, I think, that support for realizing our university vision. to become a reputable university in Asia. By collaborating with universities abroad, the quality of UNJ will be improved and UNJ will be internationally recognized. Of course, this seminar also very important for participants, especially for students and lecturers. Through this seminar, I'm sure that participants will get inspiration that are useful probably for solving their research problem or for inspiring the next research. I think the topic of this seminar is very interesting and very important for us and for our speaker, Supanjin PhD. Thank you very much for being here with us, speaking about examining Indonesia's sociolinguistic situation from Diglossia to Superglossia. Lastly, I hope all of you will have a wonderful seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Siono. So our speaker today, as you heard already, is Dr. Supan Zain, who's teaching at the Australian National University in Canberra. He moved there from Queensland. Dr. Supan Zain is extremely thank you. Dr. Supan Zain is extremely productive. He's published 32 articles and chapters and a number of books. And this is one of his books. I don't know, can you see it? Language Policy in Super Diverse Indonesia, and published by Routledge. And actually, he comes from Cinere in Depok, which is where I am now. Dr. Supan Zain spent his childhood here. So I'm looking forward to hearing his talk. So Supan, silakan, Pak.
Okay, thank you very much. Everyone.
Sorry, can I just
I will.
Sorry, can I just can I ask you to turn off your microphones and videos, because this will make it easier. And also, if you have any comments or questions, can you put them in the chat box, please? And then we'll discuss them at the end. But Supan, can you adjust your screen slightly, because we can't see your chin?
Oh, you can't? Okay, can you see it now?
Yeah, okay, fine. Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
All right. Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon to everyone in Jakarta. It's evening for us in Australia. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Problem desk dengan cash base.
Hello, can I continue? I think I still hear some background. Okay.
Okay, yes, please, Dr. Supan.
Okay, thank you. So it's a pleasure to meet you all. I've never been to Universitas Negeri Jakarta myself, but one of my cousins graduated from the university, and so was one of my lecturers. So it's a reputable university, and it's a pleasure for me to be able to share something to graduate students and lecturers of the university. So what I have here is a topic on sociolinguistics, which I hope is of relevance to every one of you. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I'm sorry, I still can hear some background noise. Is it possible to? Okay, great, thank you. All right, so the topic here is examining Indonesia's sociolinguistic situation from Diglossia to Superglossia. The topic is drawn on a research that I have conducted and is outlined in my book, The Language Policy in Super Diverse Indonesia, which I wrote in 2020.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Mama. Thank you, Mama.
Okay, so this is the overview of the presentation. First, I will show you the abstract of the presentation, the map, elements of Indonesia's linguistic ecology, analysis of Indonesia's sociolinguistic situation, and then we go on to the fourth point, which is superglossia in super diverse Indonesia, and then the conclusion. So here's the abstract. This presentation examines Indonesia's sociolinguistic situation. It discusses Indonesia's linguistic ecology using the superdiversity perspective that is in ascendancy. It argues that previous conceptions such as diglossia, complex diglossia, and polyglossia fail to account for the complexity, dynamism, and polycentricity of the ecology. Many of you may be familiar with the concepts called diglossia and polyglossia, right? So now I would like to introduce you to a new concept called superglossia in order to cater for the complex linguistic ecology of Indonesia. So this concept is introduced to cater for Indonesia's superdiversity, particularly in consideration of the importance of regional lingua francas, practices of language mixing, and the use of English as a lingua franca, among others. Okay, so now let's move on to the map. It is important to have an understanding, a comprehensive understanding of Indonesia's linguistic ecology. So far, we only know Indonesia's linguistic ecology as consisting broadly of Indonesian, indigenous languages, and foreign languages. However, this understanding of Indonesia's linguistic ecology is just too shallow in many ways. And the reason being that there are many specific elements of these languages that can actually be further categorized. So for example, if we understand indigenous languages, what indigenous languages are we actually talking about? Is it big and dominant indigenous languages such as Javanese and Sundanese, or small locally used indigenous languages such as Kelabit and Tawai? So that's just one part. The other part is the emergence of regional lingua francas, or what I call RLFs. The regional lingua francas have not been taken into account in the conceptualization of Indonesia's linguistic ecology in previous scholarship. And it is very important for us to understand what they are, their role and their function in society. The next one is heritage languages, and then sign languages, foreign and additional languages, those languages that we know as Arabic, French, German, Japanese, Korean, and Mandarin. They can actually function as either foreign or additional languages, depending on circumstances, depending on the needs and situations. And then the next one is English as a lingua franca, not as a foreign language anymore. So let's move on to the first element. The first element is Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia, as we know. So Indonesian is basically based on the Riau dialect of Malay, as you know. So it was chosen as the unifying language nearly 100 years ago in the Kongres Sumpah Pemuda Kedua, and then it is stipulated in the national constitution as the national language, as it reads in the Article 36 of the 1945 National Constitution. It says that Bahasa Nasional adalah Bahasa Indonesia. The national language is Indonesian. So for that reason, Indonesian is the official and national language. It is also the main medium of instruction in education, from primary to tertiary levels of education. Well, in the kindergarten too, except that kindergarten is not part of basic education. The language use of Indonesian is broad and multifaceted. It is very wide. Citizens of Indonesia aspire to be able to develop proficiency in Indonesian, and that's for many reasons. The main one is for prestige, right? Other motivations include the pervasive notion that it is the vehicle for upward economic trajectory and social mobility. Well, of course, that is very important, because in order to get a job, then people will need to speak Indonesian, and especially in settings, for formal settings such as in urban areas. So Indonesian is omnipresent, being used as the official language in the country in the domains of politics and the media. Now, when we talk about Indonesian, question usually arises when it comes to nativeness or literacy, because there have been many arguments circulating in the academia, and one of them is proposed by a scholar named Lauren Zent, and I'll get to one of her ideas. So, excuse me. So in the 1980s, research by Nababan in 1985 then says that the number of native speakers of Indonesian at that time, right, ranged between was around 17 million, right? That was in 1980s. And then it went up to 35 million in the 1990s, and that's based on research by Professor Anton Mulyono and Charles Grimes in 1995. Because of this reason, many scholars, especially Western scholars, have developed some skepticism as to whether Indonesians actually speak Indonesian, right? They think that many Indonesians do not actually speak Indonesian. So one of the arguments put forward by Zent is the idea that Indonesian people in Indonesia have very low literacy rate in the language. However, this idea, I have debunked this idea, because the literacy level of Indonesian based on the 2010 census was actually 92.8%. And then in the most recent census in 2020, that was more than 99%, which means that nearly all Indonesian people could read and write in Indonesian. However, that does not necessarily mean that they could speak standard Indonesian. So there's a big confusion in here, because Indonesian as a language is very broad, where the idea of Indonesian as a language could actually include derivatives of Malay, right? So for example, when somebody actually speaks Riau Malay, they would think that they're speaking Indonesian, when actually they're not. So that is the big problem in terms of data sophistication. And also another problem is language shift, because nowadays many speakers of indigenous languages have turned towards speaking Indonesian. So many of them are now developing proficiency in Indonesian and leaving behind the languages of their ancestors. And then the next one is that literacy in Indonesian does not necessarily mean mastery. So in many cases, many people think that they speak Indonesian, but they don't actually master the language, so that when they do UKBI, which is Uji Kompetensi Bahasa Indonesia, they don't actually get a good score, right? They don't really actually obtain a good score, which is questionable. And that happened in a research involving some high school teachers of Indonesian language in Jakarta. So now we move on to the next element of Indonesia's linguistic ecology, and that is indigenous languages. There are many terms that have been used by scholars. One of them is vernacular. Regional language or bahasa daerah is the most common one. Local language, bahasa lokal, has also been used, and that was used by one of them by Sultan Takdir Ali Syahbana. And then heritage language was also used in a research by Bambang Suwarno. However, it is more appropriate to refer to the languages spoken by the local people as indigenous language, right? So when it's plural, then indigenous languages. So we have an equivalent in Indonesian, and that would be bahasa pribumi. So saying bahasa pribumi would be more appropriate than saying bahasa daerah or bahasa lokal. Of the living languages in Indonesia, estimates show that at least there are 652 of them are indigenous languages, right? So that's based on a research by Badan Bahasa. So Badan Bahasa conducted research in 2017, and they estimate that 652 are indigenous languages. However, data from Ethnologue suggests that 701 indigenous languages, there are 701 indigenous languages and 6 non-indigenous languages. And these 6 non-indigenous languages are those that are called heritage languages. So in terms of linguistics, scholars in Ethnologue themselves have actually classified languages in Indonesia in terms of whether they are indigenous or heritage. As I said, that we need to use the term indigenous languages rather than regional languages, so that we could make a distinction between indigenous languages and heritage languages. Now, if we would like to see the distribution of languages and in Indonesia, then it looks like this. So we have major islands and regions in Indonesia from Sumatra, Jawa, right, and Bali, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, West Nusa Tenggara, East Nusa Tenggara, Maluku, and Papua, right? Papua as an island on its own has got 384 languages. So that's more than half. So more than half, more than half of the total number of languages in Indonesia are in Papua, 384. Most of these languages are small and locally used languages. Languages in Sumatra, there are 26 of them, 10 of them in Java and Bali, 57 in Kalimantan. So you've got Dayak languages, and they are all branching out into many different tribal languages, small tribal languages spoken around the island, spoken throughout the island of Kalimantan, as well as regional lingua franca such as Banjar. And then in Sulawesi, we have roughly similar number of languages. We have 58 languages spoken in Sulawesi, 11 in West Nusa Tenggara, 68 in East Nusa Tenggara, and then 66 in Maluku. So as you can see here, the distribution of these languages is uneven, right? We have less languages in the western part of Indonesia, which is Sumatra and Java. And then we have more languages in the central part of Jakarta, which is Kalimantan and Sulawesi. And then we have a lot more of languages in West Nusa Tenggara, in the eastern part of Indonesia, consisting of West Nusa Tenggara, East Nusa Tenggara, Maluku, and Papua. Now, if we are looking at numbers, then this is what we have. We have Indonesia's 13 largest languages. What are they? The first one is Javanese. Second one is Sundanese, Malay, Madurese, Minangkabau, Banjar, Bugis, Balinese, Batak, Cirebon, Sasak, Acehnese, and Betawi, right? So these are the biggest languages in Indonesia. Most of them, right? Most of them have got more than 1%. Well, the lowest one is Betawi has got 1.05%, right? However, even though these are the biggest languages in Indonesia, their status is actually quite worrying, right? Especially for Acehnese and Betawi, because for these last two languages, their EGIDS, which is scale level for the level of vibrancy of the use of languages in society, that's EGIDS, shows that these two languages are at the 6B level, which means that they are threatened, right? So Acehnese and Betawi are threatened, whereas languages such as Javanese and Sundanese, they are okay because they are used in the educational domain, and then Sundanese is developing. Malay is vigorous. Other languages are also developing. However, it is quite worrying for big languages such as Acehnese and Betawi because they are already threatened. which leads us to the question of language endangerment. So small locally used indigenous languages in particular, they are threatened with endangerment, right? So small locally used indigenous languages are usually used within tribes. So there's an example here that we have. Kalabit is a language spoken in Kalimantan. It's spoken by 640 speakers. There is also a language called Waru, spoken by 350 speakers. Other languages are even spoken by less than 100 speakers. For example, Tawai in Papua, and then Yetva, also in Papua. They're spoken by less than 50 people. So many of these languages in Indonesia are now dying, right? It's very worrying because if we're looking at this graph, then we can see that there's a trend, right? There's a trend of dying or dead languages in Indonesia, and the trend is increasing. Based on the research in 1994, there were less than 50, right? There were less than 50 languages dying at that time. Probably the number stood at 25, right? Let's say 25. However, in 2013, which is around 9 years ago, we had more than 150 languages dying. So let's say the number was 170. So around 170 languages, right? Around 170 languages were already dying in 2013. So if we're looking at this trend and this trend continues, then what's going to happen in the future? So Karl Aldenberg wrote a paper in 2015 predicting that within a decade, we'd be losing, right, half of our languages because the numbers would lead to more than 300 languages dying in 2032, which is about 10 years from now. I'm sorry to say, but that's based on scientific evidence, and I think we really need to do something about it as part of our discussion. Now, let's move on to the next element of regional lingua francas, of linguistic ecology in Indonesia, and that is regional lingua francas. What is regional lingua francas? Regional lingua francas are basically languages that connect people at regional level. So there are many languages. For example, Ambon Malay, Bakumpai, Musi, Ngaju, and Onin, right? Scholarship has traditionally defined them as local or regional languages. However, this designation is not entirely accurate. It's not actually correct because they also serve as languages of wider communication, right? So according to research by Nahir, these languages ensure mutual intelligibility within a group of cognate languages in a given region. So these languages connect people at the regional level between villages, communities, regencies, provinces, okay? So following Nahir, I call this group of languages as regional lingua francas. So in Indonesia, there are at least 43 of them. 14 of them are Malayic and 29 of them are non-Malayic. What is Malayic RLF? So we have a group of languages called Malayic RLFs. These are indigenized varieties of Indonesian or Malay. So these languages are associated with Malay. They are associated with Indonesian. So for example, Alor Malay, Ambon Malay, Bacan Malay, Banjar Malay, Kupang Malay, Kutai Malay, Tenggarong variant. So Kutai Malay has got a few dialects, and the one that we are including here is the Tenggarong variant. Makassar Malay, Manado Malay, North Maluku Malay, Papuan Colloquial Indonesian, which is different from Papuan Malay, Pontianak Malay, Riau Indonesian, and Sekado Malay. So that's Malayic RLFs. The non-Malayic RLFs, these are languages that are not indigenized varieties of Malay or Indonesian. In other words, they are not linguistically associated with Malay or Indonesian. There are 29 of them. What are they? Bakumpai, Biak, Bugis, Damal, Ekari, Fayu, Geser, Iban, Iha, Isirawa, Kaililedo, and Kendaya, right? There are also other languages called Koiwai, Lama Holot, Mandarin, Manggarai, Moy, Mamuna, Musi, Ngaju, Onin, Polis Dani, the Fehan dialect of Tetun, Tukang Besi, Ternate, Wandamen, Wano, Wolio, and Yetva. So as I said earlier, Yetva, as a small indigenous language, is also a non-Malayic regional lingua franca. So a language can be a small locally used indigenous language, but it can also serve as non-Malayic regional lingua franca, such as Yetva. It's one of the examples. And then there's also one interesting example of Mandarin. As you can see here, Mandarin here, it can serve the function as a regional lingua franca, and it is also a heritage language. So depending on how you see it, right? Depending on how you see it, when people live in different areas in Kalimantan, these people are usually the descendants, the Chinese descendants. They can't use Hakka languages. They cannot use Hakka or Hokkien languages. They use Mandarin instead as a heritage language. So, as a regional lingua franca. So there are many Chinese descendants in Indonesia, and they speak different varieties of Chinese, Hakka, Hokkien, Teochew, and they all don't understand each other. They need a regional lingua franca, and for that reason, then they use Mandarin. The same with people living in Sulawesi, right? They have different indigenous languages used at the local level. Then for that reason, they would need a non-Malayic regional lingua franca. And for their region, they would speak Bugis, for example. And then the next one is heritage languages. Heritage languages are not mentioned in previous literature, right? So if you're looking at literature from the time of Professor Nababan and then Professor Sunyono Darjowijoyo, then you can see that none of them spoke about heritage languages. However, the idea of heritage languages itself is also conflated with indigenous languages, for example, in a research by Suwarno. This term specifically will need to be used, especially when we would like to understand the kind of language that is spoken at home, right? Or otherwise readily available to young children. And crucially, this language is not a dominant language of the larger society. So for example, young children speaking Javanese, we cannot consider Javanese as a heritage language because Javanese is a dominant language. However, if we are talking about Hakka, then there are many Chinese children who speak Hakka, then Hakka is considered as a heritage language. In Indonesia, heritage language speakers include descendants of the Arabs, Indians, Japanese, Eurasians, Mardikers, and Chinese, right? We call them keturunan, right? So, or descendants. So that's why we have keturunan Jepang, keturunan Arab, and keturunan Cina. Sign languages. Interestingly, many scholars also did not consider sign languages as part of Indonesia's linguistic ecology, which in this case, they should be included, right? We need to have understanding of sign languages in Indonesia because they are part of Indonesia's linguistic ecology. So sign languages for the deaf community of Indonesia, there are many of them, right? Because there are at least 2.5 million of Indonesians are actually users of sign languages. However, interestingly, the latest data that I've got here from the BPS, Badan Pusat Statistik, only points to the existence of around 40,000 sign language users. I haven't got data from the 2020 census, so probably the number is a bit bigger than that. So there, as I said earlier, there are many sign languages used in Indonesia. However, there are two most common ones, and these are Sistem Isyarat Bahasa Indonesia, right? Our Indonesian sign system, we call that SIBI, and the other one is Bahasa Isyarat Indonesia, or Indonesian Sign Language, or called Bisindo. Foreign and additional languages. Foreign and additional languages are two distinctive categories, right? We cannot just categorize languages and generalize them. We need to be able to specifically distinguish them. So languages such as Arabic, English, French, German, Japanese, Korean, and Mandarin, these are usually considered as foreign languages, okay? As we know already, and these languages are also taught in schools, right? So Arabic, there is tuition on Arabic in school, on English, French, and so on. However, if we're looking at social linguistics, then a proper examination of this, the use of these languages in society, then we can no longer consider them as foreign languages. There are at least 3 reasons for that. One is that determining input solely through school hours does not reflect the present social linguistic reality. So if we're talking about Japanese and Korean, right, being a foreign language because there are only 2 hours of these languages in schools, okay, well, that's not really true, because in fact, there are many high school students learning Japanese and Korean outside school, right? They learn, in fact, they could learn Japanese and Korean more than they do learn Indonesian, or more than they do learn English, right? How do they do that? Because they attend courses in private courses in Japanese. They attend private courses in Korean. Many of them also read Japanese manga, right? They also read comic books in Japanese. Many of them watch Korean TV drama. So these
so
are...
Ben,
Yes?
about 5 minutes.
5
more.
minutes
Okay.
left. Okay, I haven't got anywhere. Okay, next one is learning is not necessarily a matter of educational requirement. There are also other motivations: instrumental motivation, aesthetic and cultural motivation, and personal agency. Okay, English now is moving to from the position of English as a foreign language to English as a lingua franca. The mainstream scholarship says that it is a foreign language. However, now many scholars have argued against the use of English as a foreign language, because now English is transitioning into a lingua franca. The reasons are there. One of them is the use of English in society, and English is actually playing a much greater role in society, and that there's greater exposure to English outside school hours. And there are also other reasons in here, right? Like transitioning to polycentric perspectives of English, and then the use of English in the realm of English education, English language education, and the domain of teacher education. And then there's also a question about the use of English as a lingua franca and language policy. What is acceptable English? That's a big question. And then the appropriacy of use English as a lingua franca and character building. Right. Now, after knowing all of the linguistic elements, so linguistic ecology, the elements of linguistic ecology, then we analyze it. There's a concept called Diglossia, and I don't think I need to introduce this to everybody. It's basically the idea that there's a stable language situation where you have the high variety and the low variety, right? And then for some scholars such as Snedden, then Indonesia has got this diglossic feature, okay? However, if you use Diglossia, then we actually cannot capture the complexity of Indonesia's linguistic ecology. So that's why many scholars, such as Lo Bianco, Anton Mulyono, and Grimes, they said that actually we have Diglossia in multilingualism, or we have complex multilingual diglossia, or we have polyglossia, or we have complex polyglossia, right? So many other terms have been offered. However, still, this concept cannot cater for the complexity of Indonesia's social linguistic situation, because those concepts do not take into account the Malayic and the non-Malayic regional lingua francas. They do not take into account heritage languages, the use of language in the religious domain, and many other factors. So we need a new concept here, and that concept is superglossia. It is drawn from the idea of super diverse environments, which are polycentric, where actually we could have more than one age. We could have more than one high variety. It is not only Indonesian, but it may also be other languages functioning as high variety in society. So when we have the idea of polycentricity, right, the idea of other elements of linguistic ecology that could become centers of normativity, then it defines the policy that imposes Indonesian as the only H, because we can actually have many H. So for example, we have Malayic RLFs, we have non-Malayic RLFs, and these Malayic and non-Malayic RLFs, they are competing against one another. They're also competing against Indonesian. So in society, it is very rare that people would use standard Indonesian when a non-Malayic RLF is spoken in society. And the same with Malayic RLF, right? And then when we're looking at the interglossic relationships among the regional lingua francas themselves, then we can see that there are actually hierarchy. So for example, if we have two regional lingua francas, they are also competing with one another. Papuan Malay against Wandamin, Onin against Iha Bugis against Makassar Malay. And then they also compete against major indigenous languages. So regional lingua francas against Javanese, regional lingua francas against Sundanese. And then we also have intensive and dynamic language contact between speakers of different languages and dialects, right? So because of that reason, then we have diversification of language practices. When we have this, then it gives rise to new languages. So these new languages branch out from an indigenous language. So for example, this is the case of Osing in Banyuwangi, branching out from Javanese, the Javanese dialect spoken in East Java. And then some indigenous languages could be accorded a similar status with the official H, right? So for example, we have Javanese and Sundanese. They actually have high status in Central Java and also West Java, and then Papuan Malay also in Papua. And then some languages used in the religious domain cannot be discounted, and that's because they are used in religious worship. We cannot, as Muslims, for example, we cannot use Indonesian to pray, right? The same with the Balinese Hindus. They cannot use Indonesian to pray. They have to use Sanskrit, especially when it comes to perform rituals in the Balinese Hindu religion. And then intralinguistic hierarchy, for example, when we have registers ranging from low to medium to high. So we have this in languages such as Javanese and Sundanese that have high, medium, and low registers. And then languages that have come to the educational domain, such as Arabic, English, and so on, they also need to be considered. And then in the previous scholarship, they are basically generalized into one category as foreign languages, when in fact they're not. And then also we have heritage languages and sign languages. We cannot just forget them. We cannot just neglect them. They also need to be taken into account. And then the next one is that practices of language mixing. As you know, bahasa campur-campur is just everywhere. Most Indonesians speak bahasa campur-campur. So that needs to be taken into account as well. So superglossia is a concept that I have introduced here in order to cater for the dynamism and polycentricity in the Indonesia's linguistic ecology. It's a it is a polycentric sociolinguistic situation in which linguistic varieties and practices of language mixing interact and perform relationships that are complex and dynamic, often interglossic and sometimes intraglossic, reflecting their varying degrees of status, influence, and order of importance. So in a typical situation, we have H variety and then used as a national language, sometimes used in education and also the mass media. There are also other elements such as regional lingua francas, major indigenous languages, locally used indigenous languages, heritage languages, sign languages, languages used in a particularly dominant domain such as religion, imported languages and practices of language mixing and new linguistic varieties. This concept is not empirically proven yet, so there has not been specific research into that. However, it has been conceptually validated in a review by Dr. Howard Mans, a senior linguist at Monash University. I understand if scholars might bristle, right, at the term superglossia because we've already got other terms, okay? But for him, it is convincing. because it reflects the complex series of hubs and peripheries that make up the Indonesian linguistic context. So that's pretty much the idea of superglossia, and this is the conclusion. Now we know that Indonesia is not static. Indonesia is always complex and dynamic. It is a polycentric, super diverse context. We have previous concepts that have been used to understand Indonesia's linguistic ecology, but they do not account for the true complexity, dynamism, and polycentricity of Indonesia's linguistic ecology. So for that reason, we need a new concept, and I'm introducing superglossia that accounts for all factors in Indonesia's complex, dynamic, and polycentric linguistic ecology. However, as many theories, superglossia will need empirical studies. We need research that can either prove this or disprove it. So that's the end of my presentation. If you are interested in examining further, then this is the list of references, and I'd be happy to contribute more in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Subhan. Very interesting, provocative presentation, full of ideas and facts. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I have some some questions myself, but I'll let other people ask questions first. I can't see any questions in the chat box. Who would like to begin? Comments or questions? Just go ahead directly.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Muzna from Mauritius. Thank you very much, Professor Van. It was really interesting presentation. Because my research focuses on religious and sacred languages and literacies, I was maybe surprised not to see in your categorization sacred languages and literacies as one major significant category when you were categorizing the languages. So that was my first question / comment. The second question is with respect to the definition of literate in the census questionnaire in Indonesia. Could you just tell me how literate is defined? Thank you very much, Professor.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the two interesting questions. With the first one, I did not use the term sacred language in there. I used language, the term language in the religious domain. All right, and this term is an acceptable term in the field of language policy. A senior scholar in the field, his name is Professor Bernard Spolsky from Bar Ilan University in Israel, right? He's one of the people who introduced the concept of language in the religious domain. So in language policy, we've got different domains such as family, school, and then religion, right? And then military, business, place, and so on, right? So these are domains which make up the environment, okay? The environments in which languages are used, right? So when I say languages in the religious domain, that does not necessarily mean that the languages are not sacred, right? When in fact they are sacred. That's why they are used for rituals. That's why they are used for religious purposes, for worship and so on. So I hope that answers your question. And then the second one, that's a very intriguing question as with regard to literacy, because that's exactly the question that Professor Zent from University of Houston was also asking. What does it actually mean by literate in Indonesian, right? So if you look at the census question, okay, Bapak dan Ibu, kalau Anda perhatikan pertanyaan sensus, Anda akan lihat, apakah Anda bisa berbicara bahasa Indonesia? Apakah Anda bisa menggunakan bahasa Indonesia? So the question is, can you use Indonesian, right? And the word use here, okay, the word use here could be anything, right? It could be listen to it. It could be write. It could be read, okay, read in the language or speak the language. But to what extent, okay? So the statistics that I was showing you, right, they are based on this very vague question, okay, which for some group of people, it is interpreted this way. For other group of people, right, for other groups of people, it is interpreted in different ways. So it's really confusing. That's why I pointed out the idea of data sophistication. When I was talking about this issue with members of the Badan Bahasa, so there were 3 authorities from the Badan Bahasa that whom I was interviewing for the purpose of this book. They said that, well, we were actually trying to specify for the census. However, there's a bureaucracy, you know, preventing us from making the question more specific. They couldn't make it more specific. They had to do it, and then at the same time, they said something like, in order to add one question, then you will have to pay 2 billion rupiahs, right, which is around 200,000 Australian dollars. And I don't understand, why would you have, you know, pay 200,000 Australian dollars just to put one question about literacy or one sub question about literacy in the census. And they said that, you know, it's how the ministry works, you know, between Ministry of Domestic Affairs, who's organizing the census, and the Ministry of Education. So I guess that's the elite level, you know, the elite level. I don't know how they work, but in the end, the proposal of specific questions literacy just didn't come through. So that's why, yeah. So
okay. Can we move on to another question from Ibu Lina?
Can you hear me?
Ibu Lina Husnaini.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Ibu Lina. Rina, sorry. Ibu Rina Husnaini Febrianti. You have a question. I'll read the question for you. Dear Dr. Zain, would you mind sharing with us how you conducted your spectacular research? How did you plan the research methodology?
I don't think you can say that it is spectacular if you haven't read it. I think you need to read it first, then you can have that comment. But anyway, I think that's an exaggeration. The idea is that I was using different methods. Basically, this was an eclectic kind of research. Mostly it was desk-based research, so secondary research. However, I also conducted some interviews with people from different areas. So there were teachers, there were teacher educators, authorities working in the Badan Bahasa. So in other words, they were policymakers. I also conducted follow-up discussions with a few of them. Okay, so the idea with this is that what is really missing is a comprehensive understanding of Indonesia's linguistic ecology, because we only understand some elements of the ecology. We do not have the big picture, right? We do not have the big picture. We do not have the map. Okay, so if you read chapter 2 of my book, Language Policy in Super Diverse Indonesia, then you will read the map. Okay, you will see the big picture, right? Whether or not you agree with that, then it's up to you, right? You will have to do something about it, whether you conduct more research to challenge the idea that I'm proposing there, or to validate my research. Okay, so it has to come from the big picture first, okay, and then all the other research comes after that, right?
Okay, is there another question?
Is there another question?
Yeah, from Ibu Tasha Amalia.
Okay.
From your teaching experience in Australia, what do you think is the one crucial linguistic problem we encounter in Indonesia, which is rarely identified and often neglected by the local people? And then a separate question, is there any specific course that graduate linguistic students in Indonesia should be exposed to? So there are 2 questions there.
Okay, I'm still trying to understand the first question.
One crucial linguistic problem we encounter.
Maybe Tasha can give a more detailed explanation. Tasha Amalia, would you please give more detail about your questions?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I was wondering since I think the linguistic field is not very much understood by many Indonesian people, and they still ask what is linguistic in the language perspective. And I think I would like to ask, what do you think is the one linguistic problem that is rarely identified and often not realized by many people that is happening in Indonesia?
Okay, right. One linguistic problem. I think it's not a. I'm not really into identifying problems. Really, I'm into building awareness. Right. So the problems are there, right? And there are many problems, and the biggest problem here is lack of awareness. For example, us as linguistic scholars, we rarely identify lots of different things occurring in society, right? Lots of different things occurring in society that can actually be researched, that can actually be examined, that can actually be investigated. And we just let them pass, we just let them pass. We don't really think deeply about the use of language of society. So one example would be the use of language by celebrities, okay? The use of language of celebrities is very rich, and they are very innovative, and they are very creative, okay? One celebrity, for example, I don't follow Indonesian celebrity or shows, but I read, how people use different words and invent new terms and so on, and many of them are introduced by celebrities, right? So for example, a few years ago there was a term called sesuatu, right? Sesuatu banget, and there was a celebrity introducing that, and then everybody in Indonesia, most people in Indonesia were familiar with it, and they used it on a regular basis. Sesuatu, sesuatu, sesuatu. And then now there's another term called sultan, right? Sultan, sultan, sultan. So when someone is very rich, we call him sultan. When someone is powerful, we call him sultan. It comes from a celebrity. It is accepted by many people, and then now it is regularly used. So the use of language by celebrity is just one example. And this has not been researched, right? Indonesian people, many Indonesian people are very much entertainment centered, okay? However, this area has been too far neglected by linguistic scholars. So it is encountered on a daily basis, but neglected. So Mbak Tasha, I hope that answers your question, yeah? Right, so is that right?
Yes, thank you very much.
Right,
Now
the use of language by celebrity, right? Okay. And then the next one is there any specific course that graduate linguistic students in Indonesia should be exposed to? Well, that would be like making recommendations to curriculum design and development, right? I haven't seen courses in Universitas Negeri Jakarta. I haven't seen the curriculum, but I think when it comes to curriculum in applied linguistics, it needs to be revised in many ways. There are many new terms. There are many developments in the field that have not been updated, right? So for example, the concept of post-methods pedagogy in language teaching, right? This is a new concept for many language teachers, for many teacher educators in Indonesia, when in fact, this is a concept introduced around 20 years ago by Professor Kumara Vadivelu. So a concept that was introduced 20 years ago, right, now is gaining trend in Indonesia, right? But at the same time, there are many trends such as translanguaging, plurilingualism, superdiversity, right, and other terms that people are not familiar with, that linguistic scholars are not familiar with. So I think we need new conceptions of applied linguistics in Indonesia, whatever the courses are, right? Whatever the courses are. Okay, so I hope that answers the second question.
Okay, there's time for one last question, I think, from Bapak Fuad Arif Budiartanto. Dear Mas Subhan, Superglossia to me sounds as though it's expressing power relations, where one language is superordinate compared to others, as opposed to the term complex diglossia that you mentioned previously. What's your comment?
Thank you, Mas Fuad. My answer would be very simple. I look forward to reading your article challenging my point. No, well, yeah, well, I'd be very interested if people are looking at it that way, right? Yes, indeed, super denotes the idea of power relations. And in fact, it does, right? When we consider Indonesian as a age, as an official age, then Indonesian is at the top, right? However, when we go to Wandaman, then to an area called Wandama Bay, there's a language called Wandaman, and there's Wandaman is fighting against Papuan Malay, and Wandaman is also fighting against Indonesian, right? Who's winning in there? In some contexts, Indonesian is winning. In other contexts, Wandaman is winning. So there you go. There's power relations. There's a power struggle between those languages. Okay. I mean, we cannot ignore the fact that languages are competing for space, that languages are competing for influence. Even when you have the terms such as complex diglossia, that does not deny the fact that those languages are still competing. So, Mas Fuad? Hello,
Okay.
Mas Fuad. Mas Fuad is my senior.
Thank you.
We used to take a course together. I hope I can see your face, Mas Fuad.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hello, Mas. Assalamualaikum.
Congratulations, Pak
Yeah.
Subhan.
Okay, can we
Okay,
move on?
I hope that answers your question, Mas Fuad, yeah?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Can we move
Okay,
on?
next
The
question.
question from Harbi Putra, who's one of our PhD students at Universitas Negeri Jakarta. Dear Subhan, what do you think about the new language, Bahasa Campur-Campur, on the middle of young teenagers, communicating on their community, such as the word jujurli, meaning honestly?
Yeah.
I think you mentioned this.
Yeah, well, that's, as I said, the use of language in social media is very vibrant, right? Many of the people are influenced by celebrities in Indonesia. And the terms such as jujurli and also the excessive use of E, right? Pigimini, for example, for bagaimana sih, right? They change it into bigimini sih. That's very common among young people. And young people in Indonesia are actually very creative, okay? It is up to us, right, as linguistic scholars to take up this opportunity to investigate the use of languages. So the use of bahasa campur-campur only reflects, right, the diversity of Indonesian people, and it also reflects the creativity of the people. It is not to be scorned at, you know, it's not something to be ridiculed, right? It is something to be investigated. Our attitude towards bahasa campur-campur has changed considerably from the time of the order, the time of the past, when the use of bahasa campur-campur was shunned. It was also ridiculed by authority. Many people were embarrassed to use bahasa campur-campur because everybody was required to use Indonesian. Nowadays, it doesn't work like that. People are more versatile, people are more dynamic, and they are free to express their ideas. They're free to express the way they communicate with each other, and social media gives them the platform. So that's why we can see this jujurli, that's why we can see this sultan or bigimini, you know, as a form of freedom of expression linguistically.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Before we close, I'd like to actually, I have lots of comments and questions, but I'd just like to raise one point about the issue of literacy.
Yes.
Which somebody asked about earlier. I noticed that you talked about, you said at one point, the claim of low literacy has been debunked.
Yes.
And I think we agree that that one question in the census about knowing Bahasa Indonesia is not useful. But another source of information about literacy is the results of the PISA test, which takes place every 3 years in Indonesia and many other countries as well, looking at the competency in the national language, the reading competency in the national language of 15-year-old students. And the most recent test in 2018 showed that 70% of 15-year-olds in Indonesia did not reach the basic level of literacy in reading, the level which is considered to be essential for functioning in society. And this is very serious, and it's been recognized by the government. So this is something that's widely understood. For example, 2 days ago in Kompas, Bapak Anindito Aditomo wrote something about this. He's the head of the curriculum, educational standards and educational assessment body in the Ministry of Education. And he said, hanya sekitar 30% murid kelas 9 dan 10 di Indonesia memiliki kecakapan minimum dalam hal memahami bacaan dan bernalar secara matematika. Only 30% of children at the level of classes 9 and 10 are literate and have numerate. So, any reactions to that?
Yes. Well, it's saddening, to be honest. And this just gives more and more, it gives us stronger impression as to why our educational interventions have not been very successful, right, over the years. I remember reading a research by somebody from Pusat Bahasa who conducted research among high school teachers in Indonesia. I think I mentioned that earlier in my presentation. She conducted research with high school teachers in Indonesia who taught Indonesian, and then about half of them could not reach advanced level in Bahasa Indonesia. Jadi dalam bahasa Indonesia saja mereka tidak sampai 50%. So the sample, well, of course, the sample was quite limited because it was only less than 3,000 teachers, and they were all living in Jakarta. But if we could have this national broad survey, involving teachers from every province in Indonesia, then we would have more comprehensive understanding of how good we are in Indonesia. However, the problem is, so far we haven't got that data, we haven't got that research, and I think it is very necessary that we do that. And so that's my first comment. My second comment is that one of the limitations of my book is that I did not include data on literacy from PISA. I only included data from Badan Pusat Statistics, right? So Badan Pusat Statistics and also some research published by local journals in Indonesia, such as Makara and also Linguistic Indonesia. So in these journals, they did not mention anything about PISA. But thank you for bringing that to my attention. I think it's really important. And I think a research that takes into account the use of language in society, right, on the one hand, the use of language by teachers on the other hand, as well as the use of language by students, right? So these three components will need to be investigated. If we could cover these three areas, the use of language in society, the use of language by teachers, and the use of language by students, then I think we would have, much stronger understanding of the sociolinguistic situation in the country.
Yeah, thank you. So a challenging research agenda there, which will
yes, well, hopefully Universitas Negeri Jakarta one day could facilitate this.
Yeah, I hope so.
It would be very interesting. I mean, I'd be happy to contribute and help out.
Good. Okay,
Yeah.
Pak Subhan, thank you very much indeed for a very
Thank you.
stimulating presentation. I've still got lots of things to say. I'll contact you.
Okay, you have my email address. You have my
Yeah,
WhatsApp number too, Pak Howell.
Thanks very much. Just
Thank you,
before we
everyone.
close,
Thank you. I hope everyone's doing well and take care.
thank you. Before we close, I'd just like to say that our next meeting will be 4 weeks today, Thursday, the 17th of March, and the speaker will be Kathleen Hugh from the University of South Australia. So another Australian contribution to our program. I hope to meet you there in a month's time. Thanks again, Pak Subhan. Thanks to
Thank you.
colleagues at Universitas Negeri Jakarta. And good afternoon, good evening.
Good
Thank
evening.
you.
Thank you, Mr.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.